People think a bridge is just steel and concrete. They only understand its true value after someone decides it should no longer exist. My name is Nathan Brooks, and the morning I watched my family's only bridge disappear over Walker Lake, the president of our homeowners association believed she had finally beaten me. She stood on the opposite shoreline wearing a tailored navy blazer that somehow looked untouched by the swirling dust rising from the construction equipment. Even from hundreds of feet away, I could recognize the small, satisfied smile on Rebecca Hayes' face. She folded her arms as if she were admiring a completed masterpiece instead of the destruction of a crossing that had served my family for nearly 70 years. The sharp scent of fresh-cut steel mixed with damp lake air, while the steady hum of diesel engines echoed across the calm water. Gulls lifted into the sky, startled by the noise, circling above the broken span before disappearing toward the western shoreline. The silence that followed felt louder than the machines themselves. That bridge was never designed for tourists or luxury homes. It carried maintenance trucks, engineering equipment, and every generation of my family that had cared for the reservoir long before expensive waterfront properties appeared on the surrounding hills. My grandfather helped build the original dam after returning from military service. My father spent 35 years inspecting every spillway gate, every drainage channel, and every concrete wall before retiring. I became a hydraulic engineer because I believed protecting something important was more meaningful than designing something flashy. Every morning began the same way. I checked rainfall reports, recorded lake elevation, inspected equipment, and drove across that bridge toward the control building. It was never glamorous work, but it was honest work. Rebecca never understood that. She arrived 5 years earlier when the Lakeside Ridge community transformed from a quiet neighborhood into an ambitious resort development promising luxury waterfront living. New homes appeared almost overnight. Private docks stretched farther into the lake every season. Expensive boats replaced fishing skiffs. Real estate signs promised million-dollar sunsets and exclusive lake access. Rebecca became the face of that ambition. Every board meeting ended with another expansion proposal. Every conversation eventually returned to one subject. My land stood between the resort and its perfect vision of the shoreline. She offered to purchase the bridge. I refused. She suggested sharing maintenance access. I declined because the road served regulated infrastructure. Then she claimed the bridge looked unsafe. Independent inspections proved otherwise. After that, the requests became demands disguised as neighborhood improvements. Letters appeared in my mailbox. Lawyers called my office. Survey crews wandered close to property lines they had no business measuring. Every time I responded with the same answer. The bridge, the maintenance road, and the dam operated under legal agreements that existed decades before the Homeowners Association was ever incorporated. Facts frustrated people who expected opinions to change the law. That morning, however, facts seemed buried beneath twisted steel resting along the shoreline. Rebecca looked across the lake with complete confidence, convinced that removing one bridge had isolated me from everything my family had protected for generations. She believed she had erased my future with one decision. What she never realized was that my family's greatest strength had never been the bridge itself. It was the quiet stack of engineering records, permits, easements, and handwritten notebooks waiting inside my office, because my grandfather had taught me one lesson I had never forgotten. When someone destroys what you can rebuild, they often expose what they can never replace. I waited until the construction crews packed their equipment and the noise faded into the distance before walking toward what remained of the bridge. The late afternoon sun reflected across Walker Lake with the same peaceful glow it had every summer of my life, but nothing about the shoreline felt familiar anymore. Twisted guardrails rested against cracked concrete, broken wooden planks floated gently near the bank, and fresh tire tracks carved deep lines through the damp soil where heavy equipment had crossed only hours earlier. I crouched beside one of the bridge supports and ran my fingers across a clean cut through the steel. This had not been the work of time, storms, or neglect. Someone had made a deliberate decision. The smell of fresh metal still lingered in the warm air, and bright orange survey paint marked the ground around the demolished crossing as though it had always been destined to disappear. Behind me, I heard another vehicle approaching. A white pickup truck rolled slowly onto the gravel road before stopping a few yards away. Rebecca stepped out with a leather folder tucked beneath one arm, looking as composed as ever. "Nathan," she called, almost cheerfully. "I hope you understand this was necessary for community safety." I looked at the broken bridge before answering. "Interesting," I said quietly. "The county engineer inspected this bridge less than 4 months ago and signed off on its condition." Her smile tightened for only a moment before returning. "New information came to light. Then I would love to see the report." She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Our attorneys have everything under control." I nodded without raising my voice. "Good. Then obtaining a copy should be easy." She gave me one final smile before climbing back into her truck and driving away without another word. I watched the dust settle behind her tires until the shoreline became quiet again. My grandfather used to tell me that confidence built on weak foundations always sounds loudest right before it collapses. Standing beside the broken bridge, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Instead of driving home, I followed the old maintenance road as far as I could on foot. The missing bridge forced me to stop nearly half a mile short of the dam, leaving the concrete structure visible only through rows of oak trees on the opposite bank. For the first time in 70 years, routine vehicle access to the spillway had been interrupted. That fact mattered far more than the bridge itself. Every dam required scheduled inspections, equipment servicing, and emergency access. Anyone familiar with reservoir operations understood that immediately. Rebecca clearly did not. As the evening grew quieter, I opened the weatherproof storage box mounted beside the maintenance road. Inside rested inspection logs, elevation charts, rainfall records, and copies of operational checklists sealed inside protective sleeves. Everything was exactly where my father had left it before retiring. I loaded the records into my truck along with several older maintenance maps stored in a locked cabinet nearby. By the time darkness settled over Walker Lake, my office table was completely covered with decades of engineering drawings, handwritten notes, operating permits, and property surveys. The oldest documents carried my grandfather's careful handwriting in faded blue ink. I spent hours comparing dates, signatures, and recorded easements while the ticking wall clock echoed through the quiet room. Then one folded survey map caught my attention. A bold red line extended from the county road, crossed directly over the demolished bridge, and continued uninterrupted all the way to the dam control building. Printed beneath it were 6 words that instantly changed everything I thought I knew. Permanent maintenance access easement. Recorded without expiration. I spread every document across my office floor before sunrise because I wanted to see the entire story instead of isolated pieces. Yellowed engineering drawings rested beside county survey maps, faded maintenance journals, and decades of inspection reports that carried 3 generations of my family's signatures. My grandfather's handwriting appeared first, neat and deliberate. My father's entries followed in darker ink, filled with precise measurements and weather observations. My own records completed the timeline, continuing a routine that had never been interrupted until someone decided a bridge was less important than a luxury view. Outside the window, the first light reflected across Walker Lake while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar through the open screen. Everything beyond the office looked peaceful. Inside, every page pulled me closer to an answer. I carefully unfolded the easement map again and traced the red line with my finger from the county road to the dam control building. The language beneath it was remarkably simple. Permanent maintenance access easement. Recorded without expiration. There were no handwritten corrections. No amendments. No cancellation notices. I reached for another folder containing the original reservoir operating agreement signed decades before the Homeowners Association even existed. Attached behind it sat copies of every recorded renewal confirming that the dam remained active infrastructure subject to scheduled inspections and maintenance. The bridge was never described as a neighborhood convenience. It was identified as the primary maintenance crossing supporting legal access to regulated water control equipment. That single sentence changed the entire picture. Rebecca had spent years insisting the bridge was simply another old structure standing in the way of progress. Official records described something very different. I continued searching until I found a thick engineering binder prepared during a structural review nearly 15 years earlier. Inside were photographs showing maintenance trucks crossing the bridge, equipment servicing spillway gates, and inspectors walking directly into the control building. Every image carried dates, signatures, and county reference numbers. The evidence stretched back farther than the resort itself. Nothing about the bridge had been temporary. Around mid-morning, my office telephone rang. The display showed an unfamiliar number from the county courthouse. A records clerk politely informed me that someone had recently requested copies of shoreline property maps connected to Walker Lake. I thanked her for the information without asking who submitted the request because I already suspected the answer. After ending the call, I compared the request dates against my own files. The timing matched perfectly with the beginning of the resort's newest expansion plans. They had clearly researched the shoreline, but they had either overlooked the maintenance easement or assumed nobody would challenge them. Either possibility carried consequences. By afternoon, I drove to the county records office, carrying a small box filled with copies instead of originals. The clerk recognized my family name immediately and smiled. "Your grandfather always insisted on keeping duplicate records," she said while accepting the documents for comparison. "He told us paper survives longer than memory." I smiled because it sounded exactly like something he would have said. Within an hour, she returned carrying certified copies of the original easement, reservoir operating agreement, and recorded maintenance corridor survey. Every seal remained intact. Every signature was preserved. Every page confirmed exactly what I had begun to suspect the night before. The legal protection surrounding the bridge had never disappeared because it had never depended on the bridge itself. It protected access to the dam, and the dam still stood exactly where my grandfather built it. As I placed the certified documents back into their folder, I finally stopped feeling like the man who had lost his only crossing. Instead, I felt like the man who had just discovered that every step the Homeowners Association had taken since demolishing the bridge had carried them deeper into a mistake they did not yet understand. The certified copies never left my passenger seat during the drive home. Every time I stopped at a traffic light, I glanced at the thick folder resting beside me, as though it carried more weight than paper should. In many ways it did. Those documents represented 70 years of careful planning, legal compliance, and engineering discipline. Rebecca believed she had removed my advantage by destroying one bridge. She had actually cleared away the distraction that kept everyone from noticing the foundation beneath it. The following morning, I called Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had represented my family in property and water matters for nearly 15 years. His office overlooked the county courthouse, and by the time I arrived, he already had a legal pad covered with handwritten notes waiting beside 2 cups of coffee. Without saying much, I spread the certified surveys, operating permits, maintenance records, and easement documents across the conference table. Daniel spent nearly 30 minutes reading every page without interruption. He occasionally adjusted his glasses, highlighted a paragraph, or compared one signature against another, but he never rushed. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Nathan," he said calmly, "if these documents are complete, this is not simply a property disagreement anymore." I remained silent. "They interrupted legal access to regulated infrastructure," he continued. "That changes everything." Hearing someone else say the words out loud made the room feel strangely quiet. Daniel explained that our strongest position came from patience rather than speed. "Do not threaten anyone," he said. "Do not argue with the Homeowners Association. Do not respond emotionally. Let them continue believing they solved their problem." I nodded because his advice sounded almost identical to my grandfather's notebook. Daniel pointed toward the maintenance easement map. "Every additional decision they make without acknowledging this corridor creates another record. Evidence becomes stronger when the other side keeps writing it for you." Before leaving, we prepared several formal requests for public records related to the bridge demolition, shoreline construction permits, and any engineering approvals connected to the resort expansion. Everything would be submitted through official channels. Every response would become part of the file. There would be no surprises, only documentation. During the next several days, I returned to my normal routine as much as possible. Since vehicle access across the bridge had been eliminated, I inspected portions of the dam from alternate observation points using binoculars and long-range cameras, while recording every limitation created by the missing crossing. I documented dates, travel distances, weather conditions, and the additional time required to reach maintenance areas. Nothing was exaggerated because it did not need to be. Facts were already working in my favor. Across the lake, construction continued almost non-stop. New stone walkways appeared along the shoreline. Decorative lighting was installed beside freshly planted trees. Workers assembled boat docks extending farther into the reservoir, while delivery trucks arrived almost every morning carrying landscaping materials and outdoor furniture. Rebecca frequently appeared on the property, confidently directing contractors and greeting future homeowners as though every phase of the project was unfolding exactly according to plan. Once she even noticed me standing near the shoreline with my camera. Instead of looking concerned, she offered a polite wave before turning back toward the resort. I simply raised my hand in return and continued documenting everything around me. Late one afternoon, another envelope arrived from the county records office. Inside was the first official response to Daniel's requests. The county confirmed that no demolition permit had been issued for a regulated maintenance bridge associated with Walker Lake. I read the sentence 3 times before placing the letter beside my grandfather's notebook. Outside, the evening wind carried ripples across the water while the distant sound of construction echoed through the valley. They were still building their future. They simply had no idea it was being constructed on top of a legal mistake that grew larger with every passing day. By the end of the second week, my office no longer looked like the workspace of an engineer. It looked like the command center of someone assembling a timeline that nobody else realized existed. Every wall carried enlarged survey maps. Colored pins connected inspection dates, property records, permit applications, maintenance logs, and photographs taken years apart. The bridge demolition sat at the center of everything, but the more I studied the surrounding documents, the more obvious another pattern became. The bridge itself had never been the ultimate objective. It had simply been the obstacle standing between the resort and complete control of the shoreline. Daniel stopped by one afternoon carrying another folder collected through our public records requests. He laid several construction applications on my desk beside the county response, confirming no demolition permit had ever been issued. "There is something else," he said quietly. "Look at the dates." I compared the paperwork line by line. Preliminary drawings for the expanded marina had been submitted months before the bridge disappeared. Landscaping contracts had been signed weeks before Rebecca publicly claimed the bridge was unsafe. Marketing brochures advertising premium waterfront access had already been printed before any engineering concerns had ever been mentioned during homeowners association meetings. The sequence mattered. Safety had not started the project. The project had invented a safety argument. Daniel smiled slightly when he noticed my expression. "Now you understand why we waited." I nodded. Every new document fit into place like another piece of a puzzle my grandfather had unknowingly started decades earlier. We still did not contact Rebecca. We still did not threaten legal action. Instead, Daniel filed additional requests with the State Water Resources Department, the County Engineering Office, and the Environmental Compliance Division responsible for reservoir infrastructure. Every request was professional, specific, and supported by certified records. We were not building accusations. We were simply asking government agencies to verify their own files. While those requests moved through official channels, life around Walker Lake continued almost as if nothing had happened. Resort advertisements appeared online featuring glossy photographs of sparkling water, elegant docks, and promises of exclusive lakefront living. Luxury boats began arriving at newly completed slips even before the entire marina was finished. Weekend visitors toured model homes while real estate agents described uninterrupted water access as one of the community's greatest advantages. Every time I drove past, I noticed another expensive investment depending entirely upon the reservoir remaining exactly where it was. That detail stayed quietly in the back of my mind. One cool morning, I received permission to review archived operational records stored inside the Regional Water Management Office. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as an archivist rolled several heavy storage boxes onto a long wooden table. Inside were inspection reports dating back more than 60 years. I carefully turned page after page until I found annual maintenance schedules prepared by senior engineers, including my grandfather. Every few years, the reservoir required controlled water level reductions to inspect spillway gates, intake structures, and shoreline stabilization systems. The procedure had always been routine. It had always been planned months in advance. Most importantly, it had always been authorized under the same operating agreement still governing Walker Lake today. I copied every relevant page before returning home. That evening, I spread the maintenance schedules beside current lake elevation reports and slowly realized something remarkable. The next scheduled structural inspection window was approaching within weeks. For generations, it had simply been another ordinary engineering procedure. This time, however, the ordinary operation would unfold beside a brand new resort whose entire image depended upon conditions that had never been guaranteed by nature, engineering, or the law. The following Monday began with the kind of quiet that only engineers seem to appreciate. Before sunrise, I stood on the overlook above Walker Lake holding a notebook, a thermos of black coffee, and a pair of binoculars while a thin layer of morning fog drifted across the water. The resort looked almost perfect from a distance. New docks stretched into the reservoir like polished fingers. Boats rocked gently against fresh pilings. Landscapers trimmed shrubs along stone walkways while maintenance crews prepared for another busy week welcoming prospective homeowners. Everything appeared permanent. That illusion lasted only until I reached the Regional Water Management Office for the scheduled inspection meeting. Around the conference table sat structural engineers, operations supervisors, environmental specialists, and state representatives who had participated in reservoir maintenance for years. No one discussed the Homeowners Association because it was irrelevant to the purpose of the meeting. The agenda focused entirely on inspection schedules, spillway evaluations, intake gate servicing, and seasonal operating procedures. When my turn came, I presented updated inspection records, photographs documenting the demolished maintenance bridge, and the certified easement confirming restricted access to the dam. The room became noticeably quieter as everyone reviewed the documents. One senior engineer looked up and asked a simple question. Has vehicle access been restored? I answered honestly. No. He wrote several notes before responding. Then the maintenance schedule cannot be delayed again. We are already approaching the approved inspection window. No debate followed because there was nothing to debate. Infrastructure operated according to engineering requirements, not neighborhood preferences. By the end of the meeting, the department approved the routine seasonal maintenance plan exactly as previous generations had done for decades. Official notices were prepared for downstream communities, recreational users, and nearby property owners explaining that controlled water level reductions would begin during the inspection period. Everything followed established procedure. Every signature appeared where it belonged. Every authorization referenced operating agreements older than the Homeowners Association itself. Daniel called that afternoon after receiving copies of the official notices. Everything is moving exactly as it should, he said calmly. Do not celebrate. Let the process speak for itself. I appreciated the reminder because patience had become more valuable than excitement. During the next several days, warning signs appeared around public boat launches announcing temporary changes in lake elevation. Local marinas adjusted their schedules. Fishing guides informed customers that certain shoreline areas would become inaccessible for a short period. Residents who had lived around Walker Lake for years barely reacted because they had seen the maintenance cycle before. The only people who seemed surprised were the newcomers who believed the lake existed solely as scenery for expensive homes. I drove past the resort later that week and noticed workers assembling decorative seating near the marina entrance, while photographers captured promotional images beside the water. Rebecca stood with a group of real estate agents, confidently describing the development as the region's premier waterfront destination. She spotted my truck for only a moment before returning to her presentation with complete confidence. She clearly believed the future belonged entirely to her community now. Early Friday morning, I arrived at the dam control building by using the temporary access route arranged through the state maintenance crew. Inside, familiar control panels hummed softly beneath fluorescent lights while digital monitors displayed reservoir elevation, inflow rates, and downstream conditions. I rested my hand on one of the polished steel control consoles that my father had operated for years. Everything inside the building felt exactly as I remembered. After one final systems check, the operations supervisor reviewed the authorization order, verified environmental compliance, confirmed weather conditions, and quietly nodded toward me. Following procedures written long before either Rebecca or I ever lived beside Walker Lake, the first stage of the routine spillway maintenance operation officially began. The change began so gradually that most people did not notice it during the first morning. A narrow strip of damp shoreline appeared where water had covered smooth stones only the day before. By afternoon, Another few inches of exposed ground circled the edges of Walker Lake. The reduction followed the exact rate specified in the operating plan, slow enough to protect wildlife, downstream flow, and water quality while allowing engineers to inspect structures safely. To anyone familiar with reservoir management, nothing looked unusual. To people who had built an entire marketing campaign around a permanently full lake, however, every inch suddenly mattered. I spent each morning at the control building reviewing elevation readings with the inspection team before walking the spillway with state engineers carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. The quiet rhythm of the work reminded me of my father. We checked concrete joints, drainage galleries, gate mechanisms, and instrumentation exactly as generations before us had done. Nobody spoke about the resort because our responsibility extended only to the safe operation of the dam. Yet from the observation platform, the effects became impossible to ignore. Boat docks that had floated comfortably a week earlier now rested noticeably lower against their pilings. Gangways stretched at steeper angles. Decorative shoreline features designed for photographs rather than changing water conditions suddenly looked awkward. By the third day, I drove past the entrance to the resort and saw maintenance crews moving portable signs closer to the marina. Several expensive boats had already been relocated to deeper water, while others remained tied at slips where the hulls now rested farther below the decking than anyone had anticipated. Visitors stood near the shoreline pointing toward newly exposed rocks that had always existed beneath the surface but had rarely been visible during summer. Rebecca stood with contractors near the central dock, speaking rapidly while gesturing toward the water. Even from the road, I could recognize the difference in her posture. The confidence she carried so effortlessly only days earlier had been replaced by restless urgency. Later that afternoon, Daniel called with another update. State inspectors reviewing our access documentation had requested a field meeting regarding the demolished maintenance bridge and surrounding easement. They want to see everything in person, he said. They are asking the questions now, not us. That was exactly what we had hoped for. We met the inspectors the following morning beside the remains of the bridge. I provided maintenance logs, historical photographs, certified surveys, and inspection records showing decades of uninterrupted use. One inspector slowly walked the length of the demolished crossing before comparing the physical location with the recorded easement map. Another photographed fresh construction activity extending toward the protected maintenance corridor. Neither offered opinions. They simply documented what they observed. As we finished the inspection, one official quietly asked whether alternate access had increased maintenance time during the current inspection cycle. I handed him my logbook documenting every additional mile traveled, every delayed equipment movement, and every operational adjustment required since the bridge disappeared. He thanked me without further comment and added the records to his file. Across the lake, the shoreline continued its slow transformation exactly as the approved maintenance schedule predicted. More exposed ground appeared each day. Newly installed decorative retaining walls no longer met the water's edge. Portions of the expanded marina looked strangely oversized against the retreating lake. The resort had not been damaged. It had simply been confronted by ordinary reservoir operations that should have been considered long before construction ever began. Standing beside the spillway that evening, listening to water moving steadily through the control gates, I realized the greatest irony of the entire situation. Rebecca believed she had defeated an engineer by removing a bridge, but every quiet adjustment now unfolding across Walker Lake was being guided by engineering plans written decades before she ever imagined building a resort on its shoreline. By the beginning of the second inspection week, the conversation around Walker Lake had changed completely. People no longer asked why the water level was lower. They asked how no one had anticipated it. Local residents shrugged because they had watched the same maintenance cycle repeat for decades. Older fishermen laughed quietly while launching their boats from ramps that had always been adjusted for seasonal changes. County employees treated the lowered reservoir like another ordinary year. Only the resort looked surprised, and surprise quickly turned into concern. I arrived at the temporary maintenance access road just after sunrise when a convoy of county vehicles rolled toward the dam. Inspectors from the Engineering Office, Environmental Compliance Division, and Water Resources Department stepped out carrying cameras, measuring wheels, and thick binders filled with documents. Daniel joined me a few minutes later, offering only a brief nod before everyone began walking the recorded maintenance corridor. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. They simply compared maps to reality, one careful measurement at a time. The first inspector stopped beside freshly installed stone landscaping that extended into the documented easement. Another photographed decorative fencing positioned inside the protected access corridor. A survey crew confirmed property markers that matched the original county records almost exactly. Every measurement reinforced what the certified documents had already shown. The maintenance corridor had existed long before the resort, yet permanent improvements had gradually expanded into an area reserved for infrastructure access. Rebecca arrived shortly afterward, accompanied by 2 attorneys and several board members. She approached with the same polished confidence I remembered from the day the bridge disappeared, but this time the inspectors controlled the conversation. One official calmly explained that the field review concerned recorded easements, regulated infrastructure access, and construction activities affecting public maintenance obligations. Rebecca insisted the Homeowners Association had relied upon private consultants and believed every improvement complied with local requirements. The lead inspector listened politely before asking a single question. Can you provide the authorization permitting demolition of the maintenance bridge associated with this recorded access route? A long silence settled over the shoreline. Papers were exchanged. Folders opened and closed. One attorney quietly searched through several documents before slowly shaking his head. No permit appeared because none had ever existed. The inspectors simply wrote additional notes. They did not argue. They did not speculate. They documented facts. Throughout the afternoon, they photographed the demolished bridge location, reviewed maintenance records, verified alternate access delays, and compared historical aerial images against current construction. The process felt almost clinical, yet every completed checklist carried enormous significance. By evening, the officials informed everyone that their findings would be forwarded for formal administrative review together with recommendations regarding infrastructure protection, easement, restoration, and permitting compliance. No conclusions were announced on the spot. Procedures would continue exactly as the law required. As the inspectors packed their equipment, I stood for a moment overlooking the lowered shoreline where exposed rocks shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. The same rocks had always been there. The same easement had always existed. The same maintenance obligations had quietly governed the reservoir for generations. Nothing fundamental had changed except that someone had finally taken the time to compare old records with new decisions. Rebecca looked across the lake toward the unfinished marina, then back toward the missing bridge, and for the first time since this entire conflict began, she did not appear certain of anything. Watching the county vehicles disappear down the road, I realized that justice rarely arrives with dramatic speeches or sudden victories. More often it arrives carrying clipboards, certified maps, patient investigators, and enough documented truth to let every decision reveal its own consequences. 3 months later, I stood on the shoreline just before sunrise listening to a sound I had missed far more than I ever expected. It was the steady rumble of concrete trucks crossing a newly completed bridge built exactly where the old one had stood for generations. Fresh steel guardrails reflected the morning light while workers completed the final inspection before opening the crossing for regular maintenance traffic. The new structure looked stronger than its predecessor, designed to modern engineering standards while preserving the original access route my grandfather had helped establish decades earlier. I rested one hand against the smooth railing and smiled, because this bridge represented far more than construction. It represented respect for records, responsibility, and the quiet persistence of people who refused to let history disappear beneath convenient decisions. The administrative review concluded exactly as Daniel predicted it would. State agencies determined that the maintenance corridor remained fully protected, the bridge demolition had occurred without the required authorization, and several improvements constructed inside the easement would need to be modified to restore unrestricted infrastructure access. The Homeowners Association was ordered to cooperate with corrective measures and update future planning procedures to reflect the protected status of the reservoir facilities. No dramatic courtroom confrontation ever happened. There was no shouting, no public spectacle, and no sudden miracle. Only official letters, signed orders, engineering reports, and carefully documented facts moving through the system exactly as they were designed to do. Rebecca resigned as president of the Homeowners Association a few weeks after the findings became public. I never learned whether the decision was entirely voluntary or encouraged by the board, and honestly, it no longer mattered. Her replacement requested meetings with county engineers, water officials, and our maintenance team before approving any additional shoreline projects. Their first priority was cooperation instead of confrontation. That simple change accomplished more than years of arguments ever had. As scheduled maintenance concluded, the spillway gates gradually returned Walker Lake to its normal operating elevation. Week after week, the shoreline quietly reclaimed its familiar shape. The exposed rocks disappeared beneath clear water. Boats floated naturally at their docks once again. Families returned to fishing from the public shoreline. Children skipped stones across the lake during warm evenings while the same gulls circled overhead exactly as they had before any of this began. The reservoir had simply followed its natural engineering cycle, reminding everyone that temporary conditions should never be mistaken for permanent defeat or permanent victory. One afternoon, I unlocked the control building after completing another routine inspection and found my grandfather's notebook resting where I had left it months earlier. I opened to the final page, where one sentence written in fading blue ink caught my attention again. It read, "Good engineering protects people who may never realize they were protected." I closed the notebook and looked through the window toward the rebuilt bridge stretching across the calm water. For years, I believed my family's greatest legacy was the dam itself. I finally understood it was something much quieter. They left behind records accurate enough to defend the truth long after they were gone. Rebecca believed removing one bridge would erase generations of careful work. Instead, she uncovered every document proving why that work mattered. The irony never stopped making me smile. She spent enormous effort trying to control a lake that had always answered to engineering, law, and nature rather than ambition. As I drove across the new bridge that evening, the tires rolled smoothly over fresh concrete while the setting sun painted the reservoir in shades of gold and copper. The same maintenance road stretched ahead toward the dam, unchanged in purpose despite everything that had happened. I realized then that justice had never arrived with anger or revenge. It arrived one certified document at a time, one patient decision after another, until the truth became impossible to ignore. Sometimes the strongest bridge is not the one built from steel. It is the one built from patience, preparation, and the simple determination to let the facts carry you safely home.